Good morning and welcome to the Colorado Health Foundation's Harnessing the Power of Advocacy in Your Nonprofit webinar. My name is Dustin Moyer and I'm a policy officer here at the Foundation as well as your chairperson for today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get started with some housekeeping notes. Our webinar today is being recorded so that others who cannot attend can watch the presentation later. Next week you'll receive a link to this recording as well as the PDF presentation that we'll go over today. We'll also post the recording and presentation on our website at coloradohealth.org. In order to minimize background noise, your phones will be muted in a listen-only mode during the presentation. The final portion of our webinar is devoted to questions, so please feel free to send your questions via the chat function at any time during the presentation. You should see a chat dialog area located on the lower left-hand side of your screen where you may type and send questions. You will also see a raise hand button, which we will not be using, so you don't need to click that when asking a question. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please call ReadyTalk's toll-free technical support number at 1-800-843-9166. Make sure to have your registration confirmation available. And finally, after the webinar has concluded, you will have the opportunity to give us feedback through a short survey. We ask that you take a minute and complete the survey, which helps us to improve our future presentations. And with that, I'll turn the conference over to Kara Lawrence, partner at the law firm of Tierney Lawrence, LLC.
Thanks, Dustin, and welcome everybody. It's nice to be on this webinar with you. I'm talking today about lobbying and political activities of 501c3 organizations. I just want to start off with a brief introduction about the policy behind why there are limitations on 501c3s getting engaged in the political world. Donations to aid a candidate in their campaign for public office or for lobbying are not tax deductible. So if any of you individually ever made such a donation or when businesses make a donation, they can't get a tax deduction. So the idea here is someone can't make a donation to a 501c3 where they do get a tax deduction, then have that C3 filter that into a non-deductible purpose. So that's kind of the big picture about what we're looking at here. The Internal Revenue Code has about 27 types of tax-exempt organizations, but 501c3s are the only types that have tax-deductible contributions. So if a donor makes a donation to a C3, as you all know, they get a tax deduction. And this is the only type of tax-exempt entity that gets a tax deduction. So it's subject to much more difficult rules regarding its activities because it has two levels of tax exemption. The donor gets a tax deduction for their donation, but then the C3 itself isn't paying federal or state income tax on that money. So that's why it's subject to higher controls. And with that, 501c3s are split into a few different categories. I think I'm mostly talking with public charities today, but 501c3s also include private foundations and religious organizations, schools, hospitals. So there's a wide variety of 501c3s. And there is an absolute prohibition against any of them participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. So that's the language in the Internal Revenue Code, and it's an absolute prohibition. That means there's no kind of de minimis exception or kind of I could do a little bit of it. It's an absolute prohibition. And again, the key reason behind this prohibition is that we don't want, as a society, it's been decided through the tax code, we don't want to have taxpayer dollars subsidize political activities. Think about it like this. If you, depending on what you want to do, if you're giving a personal tax deductible contribution to an organization that's a charity, that's something society as a whole has decided that we want to subsidize that behavior because what 501c3s do are important behaviors and important things to do. But we don't want to subsidize donations to candidates because depending on your political background and who you support, you don't want donations to go to a particular candidate to be subsidized by society as a whole or by you. So that's the big picture we're looking at here. So again, there's the policy point there, but really again, 501c3s because we get this double tax deduction, one from the donor side and one from the organization side is why there's such high scrutiny from the federal tax level on your activities. There's always a question of doesn't this violate our First Amendment? We're a C3, can't we say whatever we want to say? And actually, there's been a very important case about this, which basically says, and you see a lot about this coming up now with religious organizations, with churches saying, wait a minute, this is my freedom to get on the pulpit and tell my congregation about who I want to support as a political candidate. And there was a ruling that's still in effect, which basically says, you can say whatever you want as a nonprofit organization. There's just no requirement that the taxpayers of the United States subsidize your First Amendment right. So the idea is you could say whatever you want. You just can't be a C3 if you want to say political talk. So with that, let's start getting into the details. The Internal Revenue Code talks about what exempt function activities and how 501c3s cannot engage in exempt function activities. And that really means the very broad definition is attempting to influence the selection, nomination, election, or appointment of any individual to any public office or an office in a political organization, such as the head of a DNC or the RNC. So exempt function activities include kind of very obviously endorsements of candidates. That's very specific. But it also includes a lot more federal activities than that. For example, I suppose, let me go back one more. We're not there yet. I think everyone's quite clear that 501c3 can't endorse a candidate. But lots of times there's lots of things C3s potentially do that are much more subtle than that. We don't need such an obvious express endorsement or express language. It can be very indirect. And that's why it gets difficult, because when you're doing things that are more subtle, there's no really good IRS test into determining whether you're engaging in this prohibited exempt function activity. Also, when we're looking at what you're doing, a C3, we're talking about you can't support or oppose a candidate for public office. And that really means anyone who holds himself out for a state, national, or local office. So it certainly includes everyone who's announced their candidacy, and at some level it includes people who haven't officially announced their candidacy but have been talking about it, and it's pretty clear that they will announce. Note, though, it doesn't include such things as judicial nominees who aren't voted upon. So, for example, a Supreme Court judge, they're not a candidate for public office because they're not elected. They're only appointed. So a C3, if they're kind of getting involved in the Supreme Court nominees for Supreme Court justices, that would be considered lobbying, but not prohibited political work. So again, as I talked about before, 501c3s are prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in political campaigns. And again, this clearly applies to written or oral endorsements, but it also includes things that, if not done properly, can also be considered to be an implicit or indirect endorsement of a candidate. So, for example, if you let a candidate use your office space without charging them, that's doing some work on their behalf. If you let your employees perhaps do work on behalf of the candidate on your computers, that would be an indirect prohibited campaign activity. If you let your candidates use your mailing list or give them information that's valuable and confidential, that is prohibited as well. So that's really important that you understand that there's lots of levels of this that can be prohibited that you might not think about because it's not an endorsement. But really, any time an organization is giving a candidate or a political party something of value, such as a mailing list or something else, even some information, polling results, anything like that would be prohibited intervention in a campaign. That's really important to know. But there's lots of things that 501c3s can do that are related to political campaigns, which are basic voter education activities. So as long as a 501c3 is talking to the electorate about candidate's position in a non-biased way, that is not prohibited because, again, 501c3s are educational. So there's certainly tons of educational work a C3 can do in this realm. And as long as there's no actual direct or indirect or subtle bias towards any particular candidate or political party, it's going to be okay. So let's talk about a few of the activities that I know lots of C3s engage in. One is voter registration drives. So 501c3s can engage in voter registration drives or get out the vote drives and register people to vote as long as this is nonpartisan, which means they can't, when they're actually going through and knocking on doors, they have to just say very generally what's going on, and it's just to ensure that people are registering to vote without talking about candidates or political parties. But also it's ensuring that the neighborhoods that are being targeted are nonpartisan. So for example, if an organization only went to a neighborhood that was solely or really high-level Republican or only a high-level Democrat neighborhood, and that's all you did with your voter registration get out the vote drive, that's actually prohibited because you're only trying to get out the votes Democrats or you're only trying to get out the vote Republicans. So it's really careful when you're structuring a voter registration drive, you have to be very careful about how you target things. But what's really important is that there are abilities for 501c3s to only do get out the vote and voter registration drives for what are called for groups that aren't represented typically in the political process. So for example, it's absolutely okay to only do get out the vote and voter registration drives and trying to register people to vote for a highly African American community. And the reason why is the African American community is considered to not be highly represented in the voting process. And even though statistically in the last election, say 98% of African Americans voted for President Obama, groups can still do get out the vote drives for these what are called underrepresented communities, even if those communities may very obviously and based by data vote for one particular party or another. It's because they're underrepresented voters. So besides African American communities, Latino communities, the youth communities, homeless, the IRS is well that if you're just trying to get out the vote on homeless communities, that's okay. So it's a very interesting way of looking at C3s being engaged in the political process. That the impact might actually be to get out the vote for more, what the data says, more of the Democratic candidates, but that is appropriate activity. But again, the idea is it has to be non-biased in terms of how you're figuring out which neighborhood you're talking about. This is very similar when we're talking about candidate questionnaires and voting records. So 501c3s can certainly compile lists of candidates' voting records or how they've voted on legislation, but it's really important to look at the form of how you're doing this and what's given out to the public, because the form has to be very nonpartisan. So for example, it usually has to be side by side. You have to include all the candidates. It just has to be kind of voted yes, voted no, or just it has to be a really unbiased questionnaire. When you're doing voter guides are a bit easier because you can really kind of just say how they voted on particular legislation. But again, one of the issues that C3s tend to have that often prohibits them from engaging in these types of things is if they have a particular issue. And there's an Irish ruling where there was a pro-environmental group that distributed candidate questionnaires, and the only questions related to their position on the environment. And the IRS held that even that this actually was prohibited campaign intervention because it was an environmental group. The only questions were about the environment, so any kind of person looking at it would be able to implicitly tell which candidate the group supported since the questions only relate to the environment. So when I'm working with C3 groups who want to do these types of things, I really state you have to kind of go beyond your mission and ask a broad range of questions. So even if you're an environmental group, you should ask about foreign policy or tax issues and things like that. So you don't want to have a narrow realm of questions because that could be implicit prohibited campaign intervention. And really quickly, again, this prohibition goes for all C3s, including private foundations, church, hospitals, and the like. There's no de minimis exception. You could lose your tax exemption. You could get subject to an excise tax deduction. You can lose, donors can lose their tax deduction, and there could be injunctions and things like that. Now, practically speaking, what happens is the IRS will send you a letter, a cease and desist letter, and don't do it again. And so usually you need to make this mistake more than once to get your tax exemption revoked. But it is a pretty serious thing, so it's important. But on the other hand, we're going to change now and talk about the lobbying activities of 501c3s, which I think most of you know C3s can engage in some lobbying. So unlike this prohibition against intervention in a campaign for public office or for a political party, this prohibition is not an absolute prohibition. 501c3s can engage in some quote-unquote insubstantial amount of lobbying. So now we're going to talk about what exactly is lobbying, because that is a term of art. And so what is lobbying? And once you figure out what is lobbying, what does how do you figure out how much you can engage in without being subject to penalties or loss of tax-exempt status? So lobbying, again, it's a term of art. It means, in the Internal Revenue Code, it's the expenditure of money by an organization for the purpose of attempting to influence legislation. And there's both direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Now, it's important to know that private foundations are prohibited from engaging in any type of lobbying at all. Only public charities and churches and hospitals can do these types of lobbying. And so the definition is an organization will be regarded as attempting to influence legislation if it advocates for the adoption or rejection of legislation or engages in direct lobbying by contacting members of the legislative body with respect to the legislation, or engaging what's known as grassroots lobbying by urging the public to contact a member of the legislative body with respect to certain legislation. So, legislation, I'm going to bring you back to 11th grade civics class. Legislation is actually an act by a legislative body. So it's an act by Congress or the Colorado legislature or local councils. So it has to be legislative in nature. It cannot be and does not include actions by judicial, executive, or administrative bodies. And this is really, really important because lots of 501c3s do a lot of work in the administrative or regulatory area. Those particular parts of the government are not part of the legislative branch. They're part of the administrative branch or the executive branch. And so that means what they're doing is not legislative in nature, and therefore it's not legislation. So if you're dealing with school boards, for example, housing authorities, HICPUF or any of the other kind of Secretary of State or other regulatory bodies in terms of passing administrative rules, that is not a legislation. Therefore, a 501c3 can engage in that type of work without limitation. So that's really important exceptions that C3s can do. I'll get back to, let me just go back to the slide one more time. It's really important to note that this could be complicated because, for example, if you can't just assume that because something's happening in the executive branch of government that it's not legislative. For example, typically if you're talking to the governor, for example, he's in the executive branch of the Colorado government, and therefore he's not creating legislation. However, in certain cases, he has the power to veto legislation. And if you're asking him to veto legislation, all of a sudden he's engaging in a legislative capacity, even though he's a member of the executive branch. So that often becomes lobbying. Similarly, when you're looking at local councils, for example, sometimes they have both a legislative and executive function. So you often have to look at what they're engaging in and really kind of determine whether it's legislative in nature. So I just want to give you a warning about that. Especially, I see it a lot when people are dealing with city councils that oftentimes can be administrative and legislative, or when they're dealing with the governor in terms of asking him to veto specific legislation. So moving on, we don't just need legislation, which comes from the legislative branch, but there also must be specific legislation in order for there to be lobbying. So what is specific legislation? There needs to, it's a complicated thing. It's very easy. In Colorado, we have so many ballot measures, referendum, constitutional amendments. So it's very easy when we're talking about what's specific legislation there. The tax code says there's only specific legislation once petitions start to circulate. So for the various ballot measures everyone's going to see this November on the ballot, once they start circulating petitions, specific legislation exists. But anything up until that point is not lobbying. So there's a lot of work C3s can do leading up to the circulation of petitions, and it's not considered to be lobbying. But the minute the circulators get out there, and I always tell people just to say the minute the ballot's titled, because usually that's the day before petitions start, it's going to be lobbying, so stop. Private foundations have a lot of ability to do this too. There's a lot of work they could do. The minute the ballot gets titled and petitions circulate, there's specific legislation in place, and then you have to be careful. Now, this is a bit more complicated. Sorry, let me go back again. When you're dealing about legislation that's being introduced into a legislative body, like Congress or the Colorado legislature, because when specific legislation exists, it's not clear. We just don't know. It's not as simple as saying it's been titled or something like that. I think this is always times when I talk to my clients, but there's this idea of like it's not just floating around, it's not just general. There's kind of a sense that it's going to be introduced, and there's defined limits around it. So it's not just the idea that, oh, maybe someone's going to introduce a minimum wage legislative ballot, but it's really kind of getting more detail on what that's going to look like and feeling that it is going to be introduced. So that's a gray area. So you have to be careful there. Again, with the ballot measures, it's easy. It's when the ballots are titled and the petitions circulate. But when you're talking about the legislative body, it can be before the legislation is titled, so be careful with that. And there's also two types of lobbying, and you need to understand this in terms of calculating your limits. So one's called direct lobbying, and that's when you're directly communicating with the legislators who are going to vote on that lobbying. So, you know, when you're dealing with the legislative body, it's actually talking with a representative or a congressperson. But in Colorado, because there's so many ballot measures, direct lobbying means when you're talking to the general public. So vote yes on amendment, you know, XYZ. Vote no on ballot measure this. That's direct lobbying because you're directly communicating with the people who are going to vote on the measure. Now, grassroots lobbying means any communication which refers to the specific legislation, reflects a view on that legislation, and has what we call a call to action. And really what this is saying is you're telling people how to communicate or how to contact their legislator, their representative, and telling them how to vote on an issue. So any way of communication, you know, including saying here's their email address, here's their phone number, but it's also tying them to take a position on the legislation as well. So grassroots lobbying is basically saying, hey, contact your representative and tell them to vote no on this measure. If you just want to say, hey, this measure is there, it's important, here's how to contact your legislature, but you don't reflect a position on that legislation, it's not grassroots lobbying. So that's really important. You actually have to ask them to take a specific position on the legislation versus just to contact them. So let's talk about what activities are not considered to be lobbying. This is really important because I think there's lots of activities that aren't considered to be lobbying that people think are lobbying. And this is also very important for private foundations who aren't allowed to lobby at all. The most important exception is what's called this nonpartisan analysis study or research. And that means you're making results of a nonpartisan analysis study or research on a particular issue. It's not considered to be lobbying. And a really, good examples of this is, what they call our health foundation is. They put out lots of information, data analysis of experts on health issues. They're not taking any position on that particular ballot measure or the legislation, but they're just putting out information. And the key is the information itself isn't taking a position on the legislation, and the information is written in such a way that it allows the person who's reading it to make up their own decision about whether they're going to support or oppose that legislation. So this is a really important work that C3s can do, is putting out, again, this nonpartisan data. And that data might even be about the specifics of the legislation. So the data might say, we've done research, and the impact of this legislation would be X, Y, and Z on the budget. And as long as you're not taking a position and you're giving valuable, good information, that is not lobbying because you're not taking a position of it and you're letting the person who's reading it make up their own mind. So I want everyone to know that that's a really good way that organizations can engage in the advocacy and political world without being lobbying. Also, if a charity is also asked, or a foundation, to provide technical advice, you can do that. But the key thing is, and the technical advice on legislation, the key thing is you can't just have an individual representative or legislator ask you to come and provide technical advice on something. You actually need the legislative body or council to give you a written request. So this is a pretty formal exception. There's also an exception to lobbying if a charity is engaged in something to protect its own existence or to protect the fact that donations to it are still tax deductible. This is a really, really limited exception. And again, another really important one that private foundations and public charities can do is just the discussion of broad social issues. So let's say, for example, we have what's going to be on the ballot this year. A minimum wage, I understand, is on the ballot this year. So even if it's on the ballot and there's all these groups supporting or opposing minimum wage on the ballot, C3 can sit there and discuss broadly, the impact of, what the minimum wage is now and how people's lives are. And as long as you're not supporting or opposing the ballot, but just doing a very broad discussion of the social issues involved with minimum wage, that is not considered to be lobbying. And of course, you have to be a bit more careful here because if you're not broad enough, you could come down and actually be lobbying, but you could have a nice broad social discussion of the impact of what it's like living on low wages. And so just to get together, here's a laundry list of miscellaneous non-lobbying activities that you can all read. But again, I think it's really important to know that lobbying is very technical. You have to, first of all, expend money. So if volunteers aren't doing it or you're not funding it, it's not lobbying. It needs to be legislative, which doesn't mean talking with administrative bodies or regulatory bodies. And the legislation has to be specific. It can't be again, if we're talking about ballot measure, the ballot measure has to be titled and the petitions have to be circulated. And if you're talking about something in the legislative body, it kind of can't be floating around in an amorphous sense. It has to be, it doesn't have to be titled, but it has to be much more specific for there to be lobbying. And I'll just kind of finish up here on a few of the technical sides of things before we open it up to questions. Again, as we mentioned, first of all, you have to determine as a 501c3 public charity whether you are lobbying or not. And then, if you decide you are going to engage in lobbying, you have to understand how much lobbying you're going to do. There's two ways of doing this. One's called the insubstantial part test, which most organizations do not use. It's kind of a test that just says, based on various facts and circumstances of which no one really understands what, you can't engage in more than an insubstantial level of lobbying. Most organizations use what's called the H selection test, and you can make the selection just when you file your Form 990, and you just add this extra form, and it's in place until you revoke it. But what it allows you to do is calculate your lobbying limit. So most organizations really like this one because it gives you a mathematical way to figure out how much you could lobby. So again, calculating the H election, let me kind of give you a few examples. You basically look at your operating budget for the year. So for 2016, you look at your general operating budget that don't include things like investment income or anything like that. And then, and again, you're looking at an operating budget for the year ahead. So you're kind of guessing and you're estimating because you're not looking in retrospect. You're looking at your for example, your 2016 operating budget. And within that, I always tell people to generally say look at about 25 or 30% of your operating budget, and that's about as much as you could spend on lobbying. But it's a little more technical than that. What it really says is you take 20% of your first $500,000 of your operating budget, and then you could take 15% of the next $500,000, and 10% of the next $500,000, and then 5% of the remaining amounts, and that's your lobbying expenditure. But in no case can that exceed $1 million. And that's why lots of very large organizations that have operating budgets in excess of $1 million might not want to make the H election because you're always going to be limited to that $1 million amount, whereas very large organizations and national organizations might be able to spend more than that if they choose to operate under the insubstantial part test. So this is something that's really important that you work with like your bookkeepers or your tax preparer in terms of understanding what this amount is. And again, it kind of changes through the year because you don't really know what your budget's going to be. It might change. And also just when you're looking at your H election, it's important to know when you get your full amount, 75% of that can be spent on direct lobbying, but only 25% can be spent on grassroots lobbying. So even within that amount, you have to kind of determine what type of lobbying you're going to be doing to figure that out. Because you're really guessing as you're moving throughout the year what your H election limit is going to be, there's always a risk that you're going to exceed it. And you might not figure that out until until November is over and you figure out how much you actually spent. If you do exceed your H election, it happens. It's not the worst thing in the world. You will be subject to a 35% tax on the excess of your H election limit. But that being said, it does happen, and you're not going to lose your tax-exempt status because the IRS looks at it on a 5-year rolling average. So unless you're kind of consistently exceeding your H election limit, you're going to be subject to a tax penalty, but that's really about it. And I'm just going to end that this idea about there's lots of organizations that have a 501c3 and an affiliated 501c4, and this really can complicate this conversation. It's an important conversation. It's the subject of really a different webinar. But I do want to point out that when you are lobbying as a 501c3, you have to really figure out how you're doing that so you can figure out how to calculate your lobbying amount and your H election limits. So to the extent you're making a grant to a C4 that lobbies or making a grant to a ballot issue committee, that's an obvious lobbying expenditure. But if you have your own employees and staff engaging in lobbying activities, you're going to need your staff to keep timesheets to understand how much of their time they're spending on lobbying activities versus non-lobbying activities. And no one likes to keep timesheets, but it's really important to do so. And the reason why you have to keep timesheets, and they don't need to be as detailed as many organizations see, but they have to keep timesheets at least showing what's direct lobbying and what's grassroots lobbying. And so you can keep track of whether you're exceeding your H election limits, and that's a really important thing. So when I leave you with that is, again, this is done to, keeping timesheets and really keeping a good track of what monies you're spending on lobbying is an important thing because it's going to be put on your Form 990. There's a whole part of the 990 that discusses how much you're spending on your lobbying, and whether it's grassroots lobbying or direct lobbying. So it's really important to keep track of your lobbying, to keep good records, and to make sure employees that are lobbying are keeping timesheets. And but again, let me end on this one point: is that 501c3s can absolutely engage in a large amount of activities in the political world. You just have to understand what the prohibitions are, and to understand kind of subtle limits, because they are subtle and they can be confusing. But groups shouldn't shy away from getting involved, especially in the legislative issues or the nonpartisan voter registration issues, because that's a strong part of the work that you can do, and you should not feel afraid of doing it. It's just really understanding how to do it correctly and appropriately within the realm of the Internal Revenue Code. And with that, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Kara. We will now begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. Again, you should see a chat dialog area located on the lower left-hand side of your screen where you may type and send questions. So just throw those questions into the chat box and we'll be able to see them. The raise hand button we will not be using, so no need to click on that when asking a question. We do have one question already in. Looks like a confirmation of something that you alluded to, Kara. So if something is not yet a bill, are the activities leading up to that point, example, drafting to be proposed legislation, not considering lobbying, even if you have a strong sense of what that legislation will ultimately be?
And we're talking about legislation in the sense of something that's going to be introduced into a legislative body, or that's just going to become part of a ballot measure. So it's very different. Again, with the ballot measure, working to really assist in the development of that language, and anything leading up to the titling of the ballot measure and the petition circulation is not going to be lobbying. Now, when you're dealing with helping to draft something to introduce it into the representative of the legislative body, it's a really gray area. I would say it's this idea that something doesn't need to be titled to become specific legislation. It's very unclear. I think the safe answer is if you're actually assisting in the drafting of the legislation and you know it's going to be introduced, you're probably dealing in the specifics. If you're kind of very generally asked about ideas or what you think should be in there, but you're not sitting down and actually working with the legislator who's going to introduce it to help draft it, you're probably going to be okay, but you have to stay pretty high level. And this is the part that's the gray area, and it's difficult. So part of it's what's your risk assessment. But talking to people about broader ideas or why the legislation is important, or parts that you think, ideas that should be in the legislation, you're probably not dealing with specific legislation. But I think by the time you're helping them draft it, it is specific legislation.
Great, thank you. And again, feel free to just type your questions into the chat box. Kara, I had a question about the nonpartisan analysis. If we conduct a nonpartisan analysis of a specific piece of legislation and have reach a conclusion that it would negatively impact a certain population or the state as a whole, how do we communicate that in a way that ensures that it's still nonpartisan and kind of that disinterested point of view?
Yeah, that's really important. It's really important in terms of how you write the language, because again, when you're dealing with nonpartisan research and analysis, and you employ, either consultants or your staff to write, do studies and make these decisions, you're going to have you're going to have a thesis. You're going to, it's like I equate it to writing a thesis paper or something like that. You're going to have a question, you're going to do research, and you're going to come up with an answer. Now, again, the idea is you have to give enough information there so the reader can make their own determination about how to vote, and you certainly can't say vote for, vote against. So it's being very careful with your language. But I think, coming up with some sort of, our research data shows that this population, if this is passed, this population might be impacted this way. That probably would be okay, but if you start using more loaded language, like it's going to negatively impact this population, or they're really going to be hurt hard, that might not be okay. So it really is an example of using one's writing skills and your communication skills to make sure that you're not using leading language to impact or what the viewer is going to think. So it can be complicated. I've worked with lots of organizations just kind of checking to their organization. But saying that we think the impact is going to be this versus we think they're going to be the impact's going to be really negative because of this is a slightly different way of doing it. And it might just change it from being nonpartisan to kind of having that implied endorsement or objection to a legislation.
And that applies the same for a ballot measure or a introduced bill in the legislature.
Exactly.
If anyone, so questions on the chat. Feel free to ask specific questions that you're wrangling with, which is what we do quite a bit. So if you have any specific situation that you're trying to resolve, feel free to throw those scenarios out there, and we'll see if we can address them.
And I think it's something where it's kind of easy to sit here and listen to the talk and it makes sense, but then when you get faced with a very specific question, lots of these things are not black and white. I mean, I think the only black and white thing we see here is don't endorse a candidate or don't say vote for or vote against. I think there's a lot of gray areas, and until you kind of run into it in your own group's practice, it's hard. And a good example is I work with lots of groups that do nonpartisan voter registration, and that's a bit more complicated than you'd think, because how do you pick the areas that you're going to go out and target and knock on doors when you have financial limits? Or another really good example I often see is doing voter registration guides or hosting. Lots of CPs like to host a candidate debate. And you have to be very careful, because if you kind of say something incorrectly, or someone gets up to the podium and says something incorrectly, or if you write your questions to candidates and you're doing a candidate questionnaire in a way that's loaded, again, getting back to using your good writing skills, you could all of a sudden turn what's an appropriate 501c3 nonpartisan activity into supporting a candidate, and you could get your tax exemption revoked. So, and the other thing I'll just bring to everyone's attention, because again, this is something you might not think about. When you're engaging in lobbying or prohibited activities relating to candidates or political parties, it's just not necessarily obvious. Lots of it's non-obvious. Lots of it's, again, if someone wants to see your mailing list, or if someone gives out information about a poll you've conducted, or doing things because a legislator asked you to do something, that's all falls into this realm. So it could be very, very complicated, and you have to be very careful when you have confidential information to your organization. That if you're giving that to a candidate, that's prohibited. But if you post it on your website, it's public and anyone can see it. So that's a lot of ways that 501c3s can communicate what they're doing, is to post it to their website or just make it public.
We have one more question that just came in. So an organization was contacted by a state legislator's staff as a resource for a policy brief that they were writing for the senator. Would meeting with the staff and providing education definitely not be lobbying? And a caveat that no specific legislation was mentioned.
And that's when you kind of look at, is specific legislation in existence? And it sounds like, based on your question, that they're just writing a brief, and maybe the senator will use this information to introduce legislation. But because, if there's no specific legislation in existence, it's not. You're providing advice. And it doesn't fall into that technical advice exception, just to be clear. You have to actually be invited, have an official invitation from the body or the council, not just from an individual legislator. But if you're being asked to, as a resource, because you're an expert in this particular world of policy, yes, you could talk to them, and that's not lobbying because no specific legislation exists. But what I'd also ask is, kind of look a bit around, like it's not legislative session now, so likely there's no specific legislation because it's not January yet. So usually that should be okay. When it is legislative session, you might want to do a bit more research to see if specific legislation exists. But prior to the session, especially now versus when we're getting into November and December, it's pretty clear that no specific legislation exists, and you could be that resource.
That's great. And maybe just a question on that documentation. So if the brief that is provided does ultimately become specific legislation, IRS wouldn't look back and say that even though it's now specific legislation, because the information was provided previously, everyone's in the clear.
And that's correct.
Is there any guidance on how to document that for discovery later if it's needed?
This is always kind of a tough thing because when it'll be needed later is if you're ever audited. And the best way to provide documentation, which is it's kind of a funny thing, but I always tell clients, and just have a little, even if it's your email when you're sending the documentation, saying this is just, to provide you some background and educational information, or just something like that. If so even just some sort of written communication, or even internal memo, or just something to say, no legislation exists. We've been contacted just to give you some background because we're expert matter, we are experts in this subject matter. That's all important.
That's great.
But part of it also is just dating it. It's getting the date. Because, if it's happening now in October and the session doesn't start till January, it's just timing that will help you do it. So just a little internal note to the file that you keep.
Yeah, that's helpful advice. Are there any further questions from the audience? I'll leave it open for a few more minutes. And if you don't have any off the top of your head right now, that doesn't mean you've lost your opportunity to ask them. We'll field questions after the end of the webinar and make sure Kara has a chance to look at them. So don't feel like you have to rack your brain now, but if there are any, we'll leave it open for a few more minutes for any final questions. Looks like we don't have any, so we'll go ahead and conclude our question and answer period. Tomorrow, all participants will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording. And please don't forget to complete the short survey that will be available on your screen after we end the webinar. Any feedback you have to provide will help us improve future presentations and know what the needs are. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.